Hello everyone and welcome back to The Red Path. My name is Dara and you are watching Competitive Insights. Today is the first video in our Detachment Focus series. Over the next 2 weeks, we'll be breaking down all 6 World Eater detachments from the new codex, discussing their competitive viability, key archetypes, strengths, and weaknesses. Today, we're going to be discussing my personal favorite detachment, the Possessed Slaughterband. So let's not waste any more time and jump right into the video. Possessed Slaughterband is a detachment which revolves entirely around 8-bound, so if you're a fan of these crop top wearing, oil covered, demon possessed murder machines, this is the detachment for you. Overall, it probably has the highest damage ceiling in the entire codex, but that comes at an opportunity cost of the list being funneled into an army of expensive and somewhat brittle infantry bodies. It's an unforgiving detachment, which requires a keen mastery of positioning and trading. Arguably, it is the weakest detachment in the codex in terms of competitive viability, but that doesn't make it bad. Personally, I believe that someone who can exploit the nuances of movement and combat will be able to do very well with this detachment, and it does blend pretty much everything it touches. However, one wrong move can cause a domino cascade of lost units, immediately putting you in a difficult position. We're going to dive into what makes this detachment tick, and how you can build a list that plays into its strengths, while circumnavigating some of the weaknesses. To start off, we're going to run through the rules associated with the detachment, and break down their usefulness. Let's move to that now, and kick off with the Detachment Ability. Slaughterband, if you've been enjoying the Red Path and want to support the channel, then check out our Patreon. Whether you're into competitive play, or just love hobbying your berserkers, there's something in there for you. By signing up to either the Berserker Hobby or Berserker Competitive tier, you'll get access to one of 2 private channels in the Discord, which focuses on painting and modeling or competitive play. You'll be able to talk shop, jam list ideas, paint jobs, and all that good stuff in there. And if you just can't decide between the 2, then grab the 8-bound tier, which gives you access to both. The links are in the description below. Cheers for watching, folks, and keep walking the Red Path. Ability. Slaughterband grants the Brazen Fury ability to all units with the Possessed keyword. These are your 2 8-bound units and the Slaughterband. Functionally, the rule gives you a d6 Blood Surge move whenever you lose a model in your opponent's shooting phase. It's fairly straightforward as a detachment rule, and immediately sets the pace for what this suite of rules wants you to do: bring as many 8-bound as possible. But is it powerful? Well, to be completely honest, I would say no. Generally speaking, detachment rules which only affect certain units usually need to convey a fairly potent ability in order to compete with other detachments that grant buffs to an entire army. But when we examine Brazen Fury, we quickly come to the realization that it doesn't actually give your 8-bound a significant boost. First, the rule only triggers when a model dies, meaning that solo Slaughterbands and 3-man 8-band squads get very little benefit from this. It feels like it's asking you to bring 6-man 8-band squads to get maximal value, but when we examine the stratagems and enhancements, they pull you in the opposite direction, favouring MSU 8-band squads that can punch above their weight. Coupled with high point cost for 8-bound and low durability, you find yourself with a detachment ability that won't be very impactful outside of specific situations. All that said, the threat of surging 8-bound isn't insignificant. A good player will be able to exploit this ability and force their opponent to make annoying moves or overkill units to avoid surge threats. So while it isn't a huge buff for the 8-bound, it's also something that will have to be considered by your opponent and sometimes get you out of bad positions. However, the detachment starts to come into its own when we move to the enhancements and stratagems. So let's turn to those now. Starting off with the enhancements, we have a selection of 4 abilities, 3 of which can go on a demon model and 1 locked to a Slaughterband only. In my opinion, 2 of these are auto-take enhancements and 1 of them is a nice to have. Malicious Vigor is up first. It's locked to just the Slaughterband, and it functionally gives them an auto 6 Blood Surge move. While we did just go through the weaknesses of the Surge move, the ability to immediately max out that move on one unit does present an interesting option. When both you and your opponent know that there is a brick of 6 8-band led by a Slaughterband who will automatically move 6 inches when they are shot, it forces choices that favour the Slaughterband player. Your opponent will have to position very carefully around this unit or overcommit firepower to ensure it's wiped in one go, something which won't be easy to do if the World Eater player is positioning correctly. In my opinion, this enhancement pretty much builds out one of the key unit blocks in every Slaughterband list, and that's a Slaughterband with Malicious Vigor paired with 6 8-band. This is going to be a keystone unit, which we'll discuss more when we get to list archetypes, but it's pretty much an auto-include for me as enhancements go. Killing Clarity is next on the list, and this one is certainly a nice to have if you have some points spare at the end of your list building. Functionally, on a 4+, you gain a CP when the bearer's unit kills an enemy unit. On paper, it's not super interesting, but this detachment is a CP guzzler, so any chance to gain a command point is very, very useful. This goes really well on a Demon Prince who has the chance to gain command points if he picks off a weak unit in shooting as well as combat with this enhancement. Coupled with the Prince's new ability to reduce stratagem cost, it actually turns that unit into a bit of a CP battery. Overall, I wouldn't say it's an auto-include, but if you have floating points at the end of your list construction, it should be the first thing that you add in. Next, we have Frenzied Focus, and this one is a strong contender for the most powerful enhancement in the entire codex, let alone the detachment. This will almost always go on a Slaughterband, and it lets the bearer's unit get crit hits on a 5+ instead of a 6. This means all your sustained or lethal hits pop off on 5s, pushing your damage ceiling to ridiculous levels. What I really love about this enhancement is that it enables a 3-man Exalted or 8-band squad led by a Slaughterband to punch way above their weight class. It also gives you a degree of flexibility in your matchups, as you can attach the Slaughterband carrying it to either a 3-man Exalted or 8-band squad, depending on the opposition you're facing. Or, if you've got a very tough nut to crack, put him with 6 8-band to make sure that kill is confirmed. If you don't believe that this has a massive impact on their damage ceiling, run the numbers through Unit Crunch. A 3-man Exalted squad with this enhancement will punch through most heavy tanks in the entire game. It's an absolute must-take in every single Slaughterband list, and honestly, it's one of the main selling points of this detachment. Since Slaughterband is built upon expensive units, you need to pull maximum trading value out of every single one, and Frenzied Focus is an ability that lets you trade up into significantly more expensive units. Finally, we have a bit of a dud enhancement in the form of Violent Demise. This makes a Slaughterband or Demon Prince blow up on a 2+ for D3+1 wounds. It's certainly funny to have, and you can argue for a lone Slaughterband running into the enemy lines carrying this. I just don't see the point when you already have 2 auto-take enhancements and another strong contender. You're probably never going to take this, so we won't dwell too much on it and instead move on to the stratagems. The stratagem pool for Slaughterband is an interesting one. There's 4 amazing stratagems in here, and 2 bad ones. However, crucially, 2 of the good stratagems cost you 2 command points, which goes back to my point earlier about this being a very costly detachment to run. There's a nice mix here too in the form of maneuverability, lethality, and durability, which gives the detachment a bit more flexibility than others. You compare Slaughterband to its closer counterpart, Vessels of Wrath, the Strats are where Slaughterband differentiates itself. Where Vessels offers a bit more response to gunline armies, Slaughterband is an all-rounder that can also provide options against combat armies. Furthermore, Slaughterband strats push the damage ceiling even higher, which is something that Vessels can sometimes struggle with. These strats, along with the Frenzied Focus enhancement, are the primary reasons why you might choose Slaughterband over Vessels, so let's get into them. First up, we have Demonic Resistance. It's a 2 CP stratagem which can be used in the shooting or fight phase, and conveys a -1 to be wounded on 8-band squads. Since our army has lost a lot of its durability, and as this detachment wants you to build 8-pound heavy lists, this stratagem is absolutely crucial for getting the most out of your units. Thankfully, there's no requirement for the attacker's strength to exceed your toughness, so you can use this to functionally always push the wound roll in your favour. What I like about this stratagem is that it does actually enable you to get some use out of the surge move on your 8-pounds. By increasing your survivability, chances improve of having enough bound remaining to actually get use out of the surge move. It's another factor your opponents will have to consider too when lining up their offensives. Against a combat army, you can swing a push turn with this stratagem. Strength 7 or higher combat profiles aren't ubiquitous in the game currently, meaning you can quite reliably make your opponent wound at 5s or 6s, thus increasing your chances of surviving a push, hitting back, and making a breakthrough. The 2 CP cost is the disadvantage here, and a good Slaughterband player will have to budget their CP very carefully in order to maximize the detachment power. Typically, between this and a combat interrupt, you can have a devastating counterpunch against an enemy combat army, but you'll need to be banking early command points to pull it off. It's another reason why the Demon Prince is a strong inclusion in this army, since he can reduce the cost of this stratagem to 1 CP. Demonic Strength is up next, and to be honest, for 1 CP, this stratagem is insane. Functionally, if your 8-bounds or Exalted 8-bound are attacking their preferred targets, non-monster vehicle for 8-bounds and vice versa, they gain +1 damage. 1 CP damage 3 is ludicrous. I don't need to go into depth explaining this one, but much like Frenzied Focus, it suddenly allows your small 8-bound squads to start punching way above their weight. You can now have 3-man Exalted squads hunting down medium to heavy tanks, or 3-man 8-bound squads blending Blade Guard and Custodes. While your mind probably gravitates to using this on a squad that has the Frenzied Focus enhancement, if you run the math, you'll actually find that you don't need that 1-2 punch combo to get the job done. What it allows instead is 2 small squads on the board to be hammering your opponent for massive damage, upping your efficiency, and countering the high cost of your 8-bound units. Having a 3 damage flip switch is a very potent ability. Once you get stuck into the enemy, you're going to be using this stratagem an awful lot. Immortal Fury is next on the list, and for 2 CP it allows an 8-bound unit to automatically fight on death. This may seem like an antagonistic ability when you consider the 4-up fight on death blessing, but it's actually incredibly useful. Firstly, if you've banked on using this stratagem, it means you don't need to have the fight on death blessing up, and secondly, more importantly, it is guaranteed fight on death. I feel like I've already spoken a lot about maximizing your trading efficiency, but this is yet another instance of it. If you're planning for this, you can have a reactive trade piece in your pocket. In particular, this is where Slaughterband has a leg up over Vessels in the combat matchup. Being able to guarantee an 8-bound unit fighting on death means that they will typically be able to either trade out or weaken another unit after they've already killed their first target, essentially netting them an extra trade overall. Again, the high cost here is a disadvantage, but you have to budget for it. Between this, Combat Interrupt, and Demonic Strength, you have to be very savvy with your command points if you want to get value out of this detachment. Rapid Manifestation is up next, and to be honest, this one's pretty useless, guys. For 1 CP, it allows an Exalted squad to get a 3-inch deep strike, which after the inevitable FAQ will be a 6-inch deep strike. Unfortunately, the unit is unable to charge afterwards. I've racked my brains for a situation where you'd want to use this, and honestly, I can't think of one. Because it procs in your turn, you can't even use it on a rapid ingress. However, so it seems totally pointless to me. But let me know down below if you think I'm missing something on this one. Warp Stalkers is up next, and this one is spicy. Again, it plays well into circumnavigating the weaknesses of running a hyper-elite combat army. For 1 CP, it allows you to move or charge through enemy units that aren't vehicles or monsters. Functionally, this lets you ignore screening, which is a huge ability to have access to. The last thing an 8-bound based army wants is to get bogged down by a guardsman wall, so being able to pass straight through them and get to the meat behind is huge. Furthermore, it synergizes somewhat with the Detachment Ability. By being able to thrust deep into your opponent's lines, you increase the chances of a surge being relevant, and the threat of that surge can force lines out of position in response. I really like this stratagem, and I also think it combos very well with Invocatus if you can get him into your lists. With him along for the ride, You now have two 8-bound units that can breach screens, meaning positioning across the board and getting into the enemy lines is very easy. Finally, we have Horrifying Violence, which is another pretty bad stratagem. Basically, for 1 CP, forces a battle shock on a unit that's in engagement range with your 8-bound at the start of your opponent's turn. The only time I'd use this is in a desperate late game gambit where a primary score might swing the game. But honestly, there's 4 great strats in this detachment which are crying out for my command points, so I don't see why I'd ever consider wasting them on this one. So, to summarize, there's some great stratagems in here that offer a mix of insane damage, movement tricks, and durability. Overall, they very much push a suite of abilities that allow efficient trading, meaning that in general, playing into the strengths of this attachment will involve building lots of small units that can leverage a trading advantage. This does push against the detachment ability slightly, but I think it's best to view that surge as a nice to have rather than build around feature. You want to construct lists around these stratagems, not around the possibility of surging. So, now that we've run through that, let's look at some key unit combos which can take advantage of these abilities. The unit combos in this detachment aren't overly complex, but there is a few key ones to highlight before we dive into list archetypes. These pretty much all revolve around 8-bound, or enabling 8-bound to do the bleeding they so desperately yearn for. We've already touched on the efficiency you can get out of a 3-man squad with a Slaughterband attached, but it's worth mentioning again here. Pretty much every list will have a minimum of 2 Slaughterband which can hop between regular and exalted squads as needed. It's a keystone combo which makes the Slaughterband attachment tick. In my test games, a particular favourite has been the 3-man exalted squad with the crits 5 Slaughterband in Deep Strike. Ingressing these guys to flip enemy guns or wreak havoc has been very effective. On the flip side, having a Slaughterband with the Auto 6 Surge leading a big brick of 6-man regular 8-bound is a very different but key combo. It's maximizing your surge ability and presenting an absolute hammer unit which can deal with pretty much any non-armored threat in the game. For 1 CP, fueling these guys to 3 damage will put out enough hurt to devastate even a Warden brick, so look for one of those in every list build. Another combo I alluded to is the 3-man regular band with Invocatus. Being able to have a unit which can rush the enemy lines very early is useful for buying time, to allow the bulk of your forces to stage and prepare. I think it's a superb disruption piece that allows you to set the pace of the game very quickly. While it's a little bit expensive, you also have the option of just not attaching Invocatus and having him as a roaming skirmisher or scorer. If you're not playing into someone who's likely to screen you or has lots of MSU, this is usually a good choice. And while it's not so much of a combo, so to speak, we've got to talk about the Prince. You can probably see quite easily that this is an extremely CP intensive detachment, so the ability to negate some of that cost is huge. Further, with the enhancement to regain CP on this guy, you can actually create a very favourable economy. Nestled among a few 8-bound units, he suddenly becomes a very good heroic intervention threat and can put out a lot of damage himself. While our current points make his inclusion a bit challenging for list design, I'd expect him to show up a lot more if we get a drop in the upcoming data slate. He's a strong contender for most lists. Aside from that, there isn't any other unit combos which aren't immediately obvious. The detachment is focused on spamming 8-bound, and that's what you're going to want to do every time. It very much is a does what it says on the tin kind of vibe, so don't get too cute and play to the strength of the rules. With that said, I've identified 2 list archetypes which really push the detachment, so let's look at those next. As part of our detachment deep dive series, we are going to be presenting what we think are the most common and viable archetypes for each detachment. By archetypes, what I mean is the overall list concept rather than specific lists, since we want these videos to be useful after multiple point changes, though I will be including example lists in here as well. For Possessed Slaughterband, I've come to the conclusion that there are 2 main archetypes which are comp viable, so for this section of the video, we're going to discuss them. First of these is definitely going to be familiar to people who played with the Brosy variant of Vessels of Wrath. It broadly follows the same concept, hard-hitting combat squads with reliable, ranged support. Obviously, we've seen that the world leaders have gotten a substantial lift in the shooting department, so the range support element is quite varied now. From a general archetypical point of view, the list wants a solid core of 8-bound units backed up by 2 gun platforms and a selection of skirmishing and scoring pieces. In a way, It's a fairly easy archetype to build lists for, and it almost writes itself. The most important part is balancing your 8-bound component with your scoring and skirmishing. If you lean too hard into one, you start to suffer in the other. The archetype is good for controlling the pace of the game. Your fire support elements can force engagements by putting pressure on the opponent's lines, while staggered waves of 8 bounds playing around the midfield can cause a nightmare scenario of push and pull. You're going to be light on unit count, so extending into your opponent's lines is never a good choice. Instead, you want to do a lot of lane management with fire support, and push midfield objectives first with scoring trash, and then with 8-bound units. Let's start by considering our gun support options for building this archetype, as they're a key part of making it work. First, and probably top of the list, is the Forge Fiend. A pair of these complement your 8-bound units very well. They can crack open light transports, whittle down infantry bricks, or soften things up for the big punch. Being relatively maneuverable, you shouldn't struggle too much with their positioning, and they feel like a natural complement to what this attachment wants to be doing. You could also genuinely consider Predators in this list too. Personally, I value the Destructor in this detachment. Its datasheet ability to give an enemy unit -1 to hit for their next turn is valuable for preserving your 8-bound. Yep, it probably won't wipe things out to the same degree as a Forge Fiend, but you can actually become quite durable if you start to stack -1s to hit with a -1 to wound stratagem. If you're looking to build into a more defensive, reactive playstyle, I'd consider these pieces as they'll help keep your 8-bound around for longer. Finally, we have to consider the Land Raider in this equation. There's a couple of good arguments for taking the old Trundle bus in Slaughterband. Probably the biggest appeal is the target range. The Raider is typically going to be gunning things which the detachment might struggle into otherwise. That being the very heavy armor or Titanic type of units. While it's unlikely to bring down a knight in a single volley, it could take enough wounds off it to have Exalted bring it down without any supporting stratagems. Overall, Slaughterband favours a majority of regular 8-bound over Exalted, so packing in a Land Raider to add a bit of extra anti-tank is preferable over, say, a Forge Fiend which wants to be gunning heavy infantry, which you're not really struggling with. Another point in favour of the Land Raider is the fact that it can transport 8-bound. If you want to keep your big 6-man brick safe, it's the perfect tool for the job. You can sometimes leverage a bit of extra movement with its disembark as well, and its secondary guns and combat potential are nothing to be sniffed at. Overall, I actually really like the Raider in Slaughterband, and I've run it out a few times to pretty good success. So, once you've selected your ranged fire support, you have to start working out how many 8-bound units you want to include. This is where things get a little bit tricky in list building. I've always included one 6-man 8-bound squad and a selection of 3-man skirmishers as well. How you divvy these up is up to you, but depending on your HQ selection, you'll probably find yourself with 3 to 5 3-man squads of various bound types. At a bare minimum, you want one 3-man Exalted, so don't leave home without that. Usually, I find that you end up with anywhere between 18 and 21 8-bound in total, usually divided into a 6-man regular band, 2 3-man regular bands, and 2 3-man Exalted. Finally, with your remaining points, you want to look at skirmishing and HQ support. The obligatory 2 Slaughterband will have to go into this with their enhancements as well, and then it's a choice of taking the Prince or not. If you don't take the Prince, you can go with a bigger screen. Personally, I've found that if you go with the fire support archetype, you end up having 1 or 2 skirmishing units short of a comfortable list, and it's a challenge to be happy with what you've put together. It feels bad when you don't include the Prince in the build though, and if he's in, you're only going to have a couple of early trade pieces, so it's a difficult decision to make. Honestly, it's the hardest part of list construction because you absolutely can't afford to sacrifice on bound or fire support. In general, I think the archetype functions well at pacing the game and dictating trades, but it can struggle if it plays into a high pressure army, as your screen can be overrun quickly, forcing you to commit. The archetype is what I initially started playing with, but I've sort of moved on to a different one which suits me better. That's not to say this archetype is bad. For what it's worth, I didn't lose any games with it, but it was stressful to run, and I constantly felt like I was one mistake away from total collapse. So let's look at an alternative archetype now, which drops the guns in favour of a full-on meat wall. So this next archetype is what myself and the patrons have lovingly come to refer to as Oil Hub, since it goes all in on the 8-bounds and maximises detachment rules to the detriment of no range support whatsoever. This build is a lot more similar to the Dabrowski Vessels archetype, where it forces an oppressive amount of 3-wound bodies in your face, and asks your opponent a simple question: what now? It's not dissimilar to the fire support archetype, but by dropping the guns, you bulk out your 8-bound and screening units. Broadly speaking, it's an MSU trading build designed to control the midboard through sheer weight of continuous pressure and its peak passive-aggressive playstyle. A core facet of the archetype is the bulked out screening and skirmishing units. With early extra game trading pieces, you won't be forced to commit valuable 8-bound units if you decide the time is right. Where the gunlight sport build might have 2 spawn units and a single goremonger squad, this build could be looking at up to 3 spawn units, goremongers, and additional jackals. This allows you to actually construct a good screen for your 8-bound, and 3 spawn skirmishers allow early game scoring without committing anything serious. Again, the bounds quantity is largely dictated by how you build out your screens and what HQs you include. If you take the Prince, you'll obviously have less 8-bound to work with, but a more efficient economy. And while there's not necessarily a correct answer, I found better success by leaving the Prince out and simply overloading on 8-bounds in this archetype. While you won't have the ability to reach across the board with fire support, you'll have continuous waves of highly lethal infantry punching the midboard from turn 3 onwards, meaning you'll probably burn out around turn 5, but you should have accumulated enough victory points to win through. Again, it's a tough build to play, and it relies an awful lot on patient staging and committing minimal resources to get the job done. 2 hallmarks of the passive-aggressive playstyle. And before we finish things up here, we're going to take a look at an example list for each of these archetypes, so you can see what I'm talking about. Let's start with the range support archetype, and the list I've got here is pretty good, with a solid balance of 8-bounds, good economy, and range support. It starts off with a Demon Prince on foot for our CP reduction, and 2 Slaughterband, one with Vigor and one with Focus. What a surprise. We then have 3 units of Jackals. While I would like a Goremonger squad in here, it's just not possible with the current points, but they'd be the first thing I'd add if we gain some leverage. However, the Jackals can form a solid screen, do some early actions, and just be a nuisance. Following them up is 2 units of Spawn for early skirmishing, scout bullying, and scoring pieces, forcing the opponent to engage with you. And then we move to the meat of the list. Here, I've got 1 6-man regular 8-bound squad and 2 3-mans. They're followed up by 2 3-man exalted squads. This, in my opinion, is a good balance of infantry vehicle blenders. The Slaughterband can then alternate between them as needed. In the range support, we have 2 Forge Fiends, which we've already discussed as being excellent gunline platforms. Overall, the list composition is fairly solid. A nice meaty wave of 8-bound nestled behind an annoying trade wall while the Forge Fiends are pounding the opponent's lines. This, I would say, is a good starting list for anyone who wants to try Slaughterband. But what if you want to go all in on the oil? Let's look at something a bit spicier. So for this second list, I've dropped the guns and dropped the Prince, leaning hard into the second archetype. There's 3 Slaughterband leading things up, with the typical 2 enhancements and a naked one. We've gone to 2 Jackal squads and gained a Goremonger squad, and we're up to 3 Spawn squads, so our skirmishing line is quite better, meaning we can be more patient and commit our 8-bounds at a later stage. Speaking of the 8-bound, it's a similar layout. We've got 6 regular 8-bound, 2 3-mans, and in the exalted category, we mirror it with a 6-man exalted and 2 3s here too. This is a very brutal core which can afford to stagger itself in its pushes. The 6-man exalted will rarely need support to kill their target, and the Slaughterband have a variety of units they can slide into depending on the matchup. That said, while I do love this list, it is very unforgiving. Newer players will get overexcited and hard commit too many 8-bound at once and basically get tabled in response. It's all about biding your time and surgical strikes. It's currently my favourite list, and it's worth noting, if 8-bound do receive a points drop, this list will gain quite a bit. With all that said and done, just how good is the Slaughterband detachment? Well, I think it's a pretty skill-intensive detachment which needs a strong, patient pilot to get the best results. It is without a doubt the weakest detachment in the book, and there's a solid argument to be made for just taking these lists in vessels. However, I've personally been really enjoying it, and you can absolutely nuke things with crits 5 and 3 damage. I have found that with the sheer volume of 8-bound, you end up reviving quite a few models with the Slaughterband as the game goes on, and the strats allow a certain amount of decent durability. Overall, I found it a tough detachment to play, but very rewarding. It's great in the hands of a good player, and with a couple of point drops in the future, it could be a menace on the tabletop. I wouldn't recommend it as an intro detachment for anyone starting the army, but if you want to improve your combat game, it's a great one to practice with. So for now, let's wrap this video up. If you've gotten this far, thank you so much for watching. We'd appreciate it if you could drop a like, comment, or subscribe to the channel, and hop into our Discord. If you want to support us further, check out our Patreon link down below. We've got plenty more detachment videos rolling out over the next couple of weeks, so make sure you check them all out. But until then, I've been Dara, you've been watching The Red Path, so stay healthy, stay safe, and kill, maim, burn.